Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so excited and grateful to be here on Larrakia Country presenting this panel this afternoon. So in bringing together this panel discussion, I really wanted to draw on the theme of healing, particularly for our future generations and our future leaders. I wanted to draw on healing as this all-encompassing, philosophical and holistic process. Healing as a process and an action. It's a verb. It's something we're working on and we're all kind of doing. It's also an idea like, do we need healing? And if we do, why? Like, what are some of the issues that our young generations are facing in Australia as First Nations people? I'm really, really proud to bring together such a wealth of knowledge to this panel. These guys are our future leaders, and I'm so excited to welcome them onto the stage. Hello. I'll let these guys all introduce themselves really briefly. Just a quick note, we have the wonderful Rona Glynn-McDonald behind us in the massive screen. Unfortunately, she got stuck in Melbourne due to COVID, but we're so lucky to have Rona still here. Hey, Rona, how are you going?
Hey, I'm well, thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Do you want to briefly introduce yourself to everyone here?
Hi, everyone. My name is Rona Glynn-McDonald. I'm a Kaditch woman from Central Australia, grew up in Mbarntwa, Alice Springs, and I'm currently calling in from Wurundjeri country and just want to acknowledge Wurundjeri elders and ancestors for looking out for me while I am on this beautiful country locked down.
Next we have Ben Abbatangelo.
Yeah, my name's Ben Abbatangelo, as Nina just said. My family are Gunnar Kerner and Watchabalik from Eastern and Central Victoria. I've been calling Darwin home away from home for the last 12 to 18 months, which has been a real treat. And yeah, just very grateful to be here in Darwin. What a place, what a people.
Hi everyone, my name's Kylie Burn and I'm an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person from Darwin, grew up here. My mother's also from here and my mother's mother. And my grandfather, he's from Torres Strait and moved over here as a pearl diver. And I'm happy to be here today and thank you for having me.
My name's Justin. I'm a Gamilaroi and Ewan man from New South Wales. Dad's mob's from a little village called Wreck Bay down New South Wales south coast, and Mum's family's from a place called Moree in northwest New South Wales. And I grew up down the south coast and been here in Darwin the last 4 months and calling Larrakia Country home as well.
Awesome. So I wanted to start today's discussion with just sort of diving in and exploring, what does healing mean to each of you guys and how might you actively apply that in your day-to-day life as a young First Nations person?
Yeah, I think when I was thinking on this on the way in, it's to recognise that we're not a homogenous group of people, right? And that our experiences are very unique, although that there are some probably common themes that bind us together. So I think what healing would look like for someone like me would be very different to, perhaps some of the old people who have been taken away from their families, who have been displaced from their country, as well, very different to maybe, some of the youngsters that are coming up through the system, still with these really average narratives that are being taught to them. So to me, it's I don't know if you can get to a complete state. I am consciously aware that there is a lot of violence around us, and that violence is monetized in lots of different ways. And, for me, I think there's moments in the day as you're trying to change things that you can feel, maybe moments of solitude or solace. And perhaps when you've got more space and time, there's a chance to maybe reflect and try and make sense of, yourself and who you are, where you've come from, everything that's happening around you. So, I think as a young man, I'm probably not a exhibit that people should be following, but I'm very conscious that, in all seriousness, for people that have grown up in hyper-masculine environments, I'm very conscious that there are some things that I've been taught that I should probably look to lose.
As a First Nations person, or just generally as a young man?
I think as a young man, definitely. And I think growing up, it was in these hyper-masculine environments, I think very difficult to conceptualize what masculinity is, and also very difficult to practice femininity, which I think we're intrinsically, designed to express. So I'm not sure if that makes too much sense, but it's that's maybe my take on it to start.
Yeah, I found the line of work that I've found myself in previously with ranger groups and land management, and now with community development, it's building those relationships with community members and understanding, their stories and hearing the history of the NT and our regions has helped me kind of reflect on my own healing that I have to do within. And you think of healing as like a scar. If you have a cut that needs to be healed, there's always that scar thereafter. And it's something that you have to acknowledge that healing is a process, but it's something that stays with you as well, I think.
Yeah. I think growing up, and one thing that's really common amongst all of our different mobs is that spending time on country and sort of recharging your soul is a big concept amongst a lot of our people. And so that's particularly true for me. Growing up, I always felt like going home to Wreck Bay or going home to Moree, spending time with family, was always sort of healing for the soul. But as I've grown up and, like through medical school, you're taught a very strong biomedical approach to things. And so then you start to think of healing in terms of cells, and the cells form a part of the body, and then like repairing of cells and the processes involved in that becomes your definition of healing. And so it's trying to reconcile and see commonalities between biomedical approaches, Western biomedical approaches, and our traditional knowledges. And so I think, trying to combine those two things for me in my work, and particularly here in Darwin, compared to where I was working in Sydney, has been something really vital to healing of people, I think.
Rona, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's such a great question to ask. And, for me, I'm on an ongoing process of healing, as is everyone, and figuring out what that means for me as an individual within my own community. But I really see that from my perspective, healing is centering our cultures, our aspirations, and our knowledge systems as individuals and communities. It's living in defiance of the colonial systems that we currently live within. Those systems have been designed to marginalise First Nations communities, but actually marginalise many communities. They're systems built for a few and not for many. And when we think about healing, our whole world is wrapped up in trauma, and it's trauma from the past, it's trauma from now, and it's trauma that our future generations will experience as well. And that's trauma that everyone is holding, not just First Nations communities. And from my perspective, we've got to heal everyone, but we have to heal ourselves first. And as a young woman who grew up, in Mbantua, I left community to go to education systems, to go to uni in a really white colonial context when I was 17. And this growing wave of young people leaving community and leaving country is powerful, but it's also incredibly challenging. And since, those last 7 years have happened and I was living on Wurundjeri country, and for myself realising that, while education is so important, education and staying connected to country and community and language and culture is the most important thing I can do to heal myself and to heal my ancestors, to heal my family, and to heal the young ones that will follow in the footsteps of giants. And to do that is the ultimate act of defiance. And I think there's a growing movement of young people who are the First Nations across Australia who are strengthening culture, who are wanting to continue to be embedded in community. And within the context of COVID-19, we saw so many young people go back to country and spend so much time with their families, which has been healing and beautiful and incredible to see that how that has impacted us in some positive ways, although COVID's been really negative for the world. There's some silver linings in it, I think, for young mob. But I had someone say to me on Zoom last year, I was talking about how I needed to get back home to heal, and they said, what's this idea that we keep holding on to about we have to go to country to heal? We should be going to country and being with country, to live in reciprocity, to sing, to dance, to play, to speak language, to do ceremony. And I think that perspective has really shifted my thinking about my own healing over the last year. It's being with country, continuing to be with the community always, because healing is embedded in that. It's not a moment. You can't just go back and experience it and then head back to the city and expect that you're going to be healed and live in this cycle. And I think, centering country and centering culture is the greatest act of healing, and that is liberation.
Thanks, Rona. I guess just on that though, if and I think everyone can answer to this. You all spoke about an ongoing trauma and if we can return to country and that's healing. But if there is ongoing traumas in our lives from, different societal pressures and just the systems that we exist in, can we reach the state of, being healed, I guess? Or is healing just always going to be ongoing?
No, I think for me, it's been particularly eye-opening working here in Darwin compared to metropolitan Sydney.
Yep.
And the health outcomes here, there is such a stark difference between metropolitan centres and regional places like Darwin and Katherine and things like that. And so there's such a disparity in the health that I see every day at work that, sometimes you very briefly entertain the idea that it is sort of hopeless. And it's very hard to say, and I could hear a few people sort of groan when I say that, but it's very tough. And then that in and of itself, seeing the trauma and seeing the health inequities is then a form of violence, I feel, to me as an Aboriginal person working in a Western biomedical system. That is also trauma to me, seeing that. And so it's very difficult. I feel that there is light at the end of the tunnel, quote unquote, but I feel that it's going to take a little while to get there. And I feel like it takes, and you can see the tides sort of slowly changing now, but it takes political will, it takes human goodwill as well, and it takes societal will to shine a light on these sort of issues, so then more resources, more focus, more awareness is created about this, because people, like I have a lot of doctor friends, some of whom are in the room, who have spent time, they go overseas to help out in like third world countries and help other places. Whereas like here in the Territory, there's a third world country here in our backyard, and it doesn't seem like people know about that down south. And so that awareness is just not there. And I think that in order to heal and in order to move forward and address these outcomes, I think there has to be equitable service delivery. And the only way to do that is to get the attention of people who hold power down south.
Yeah, I think just building on that, it's heck, if you're a human and you've got a heartbeat, you're going to get marked by some of the things that are happening directly and indirectly. And there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but I think having spent quite a bit of time around the world over the last few years, I think Australia's threshold and our acceptance and tolerance of all of this violence that is happening around us, all of these inequities that you talk about, which are which the alarms have been sounding forever and a day. And, we've had a good chance probably over the last 12 months around the world to kind of begin to reconcile or recognise, probably not even reconcile, but recognise, the challenges that, or these injustices that have kind of reverberated from one generation onto the next. And everyone felt good about themselves, but not much has changed. So, yeah, I don't know if healed is, I'm not sure, is that plural, is attainable, but I think that we can personally speaking, maybe find tools and mechanisms to, to repair ourselves, to stop these, physical scars, but also internal, scars that continue to mutate. I think that we can address them, but I just can't unsee the things that I see. And for as long as my heart is beating, and I'm seeing the things that I'm seeing, it's going to, take some sort of a toll.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. When you work, and I think people that work in communities as well can relate to this, when you're building relationships with people, and you start to understand some of, their story and their traumas that they hold, and a lot of things that happen in community and urban as well, that you hear and happen to people that you care about, it kind of forces you to look inwardly as well at your own traumas, and it can be quite confronting. And even if you are facing it and you're starting to heal, it's always there. It always stays with you,
I completely agree with everything that everyone's been sharing, and I think that act, it doesn't end, and healing doesn't end, but also to centre healing is a privilege. Like for so many people, in community, wherever that is across Australia, they're just surviving. People are just trying to survive, and to centre healing when you're surviving, and that's, the most important thing is to be able to continue to live and do what you do every day. It's really challenging to think about how do we, support people's social and emotional well-being, and whether it's physical healing or emotional healing or healing from trauma. It's such a privilege to even be able to centre that in your life. So I think, when we're thinking about healing in a broader context, we're never going to get to a state of healed, I don't think, but we've also got to ensure that everyone gets the opportunity to centre their own healing.
On that, Rona, I think it would be really nice, a lot of the work you do does, in centering, I think this idea of healing, you have a platform called Common Ground that is about, storytelling and giving, First Nations voices a platform to be able to tell their truths. Can you talk a bit to this idea of storytelling and why that's so important to healing?
Yeah, I think when we think about storytelling and we think about colonisation, from my perspective, our world was colonised through storytelling. It was colonial narratives spread across the world that enabled invasion and enabled the continued colonial violence across our country. Storytelling is what's built the systems we live within, inequitable systems built on colonial narratives, and it's individuals across Australia that hold these stories and these biases and continue to perpetuate the systemic disadvantage that our community faces. But from my perspective, storytelling also has the opportunity to bring people together, and through telling our stories from a First Nations perspective, when someone tells their story, whether it's through Zoom, through a film, through an online medium, through written form, speaking that truth and sharing that truth is an act of healing. When we tell all those stories, whether it's in community, in close context, or whether it's across Australia, we are healing ourselves and healing not just, individuals or communities, but healing our ancestors as well. When we think about storytelling, it's non-linear, it's bound up in so many different times in a really non-linear way. And from my perspective, in the same way that trauma is held over generations, storytelling and healing through storytelling can happen over generations as well. And I think when we provide those spaces for our communities to use our voices, we can heal not just First Nations communities, but all over Australia as well.
Yeah, I think as well, Rona, on that, it's just to express, right? I think the concept of healing, or when we talk about scars or we talk about the things that are happening, it kind of sucks the air out of the room, and we kind of all sink down into our seats and it becomes a really mellow tone. But with that healing, Rona, and through expression is where we can also find joy and start to, I think, for many people, not only just reconceptualize these notions of freedom or these abilities to unapologetically express, but I think we can, in those moments of expression, can maybe subconsciously start to repair some of the wounds that, are festering away, because I know for probably all of our parents, the story of expression looks very different. It's probably more stay in line, not having the ability to even recognise that you've got a voice, let alone to use it. So, I think maybe just the one thing to build off that, Rona, is just the joy in expression. And that comes in many forms, whether it is through your culture, whether it is through your language, whether it is through your storytelling. But I think that's maybe, one thing for me that has, brought solace, that has brought, moments of rejuvenation and replenishment as well.
I think one thing that Rona spoke about that I think is really important is that, and in any sort of teamwork environment, we always use the phrase that you're only as strong as your weakest link. And, if we want our society to be the strongest and the best and be all inclusive, then we need to bring the other people who aren't able to be there with the rest of society, who are feel like they're left behind. They have to be brought up as well. And I think that's an important thing, particularly in the last year. Last year there was a lot of conversation around Black Lives Matter, and then a huge conversation or argument that all lives matter. And I think it's important to note that. Sorry, I could see everyone's blood pressure just went up onto the panel. But I think that it's important to know that, yes, look, all lives matter, but all lives can't matter while black people get killed. So we're only as strong as our weakest link. And, if as a society you are we're here, colonization is still happening. And we're in a society now, and people always bring up the argument it's happened in the past, it's 200 years ago, etc. I think that it's important to know that now, if you want us to be a strong society, then you have to bring the people with you, and
or get out of the way.
Or get out of the way. And also, if you're now living here and you've settled here and you've got families and houses and stuff here, I feel like you should have a deep sense of duty, because you are now custodians of, or you share land now with the oldest continuing culture on the planet. I'm like, why isn't that emphasised? If you are custodians of the oldest living culture on the planet, why aren't you focusing on ensuring that continues? And why isn't that the sort of front page of any of our sporting events or lectures and in our colonial institutions? I think it's important to recognise that in order to move forward together as a people, as a whole, you need to make sure that the people who are affected by colonisation and who have been left behind for 200 years needs to be brought up with them before anything can be considered equitable.
So as young people, or as a young person, and all of you guys, do you feel like you're getting that space to be able to speak your truths and in the world you exist in and work in? And
I think Rona, you might be able to speak to this pretty well too. I spent a few years ending up in lots of strange rooms, whether that's with prime ministers, CEOs, vice chancellors, venture capitalists, you name them. And I think there's an onus, when you get in those rooms, not to just sit back or to pacify the message that you are articulating, or to, maybe get lost in, to maybe accept the apathy or the lack of urgency. And I think there's, fine lines to be walked when you're maybe a little bit younger. But I think over the last probably 12 months more so, I've just gotten used to telling people to beat it in those environments where, and I say that because we love to talk. We love to get into these different environments, and we love to make each other feel good. We love to conceptualize things, but then not meet any of those. And then do nothing. So I think for what I'm seeing, and Rona, you might be able to talk to it as well, is that there's this new wave of young people coming through, which is the dominant, demographic of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people is that young generation who are, growing up knowing that they're not necessarily a problem to be fixed, but, they have the capacity to maybe fix everything else. And if you're going to stand in the way, then there's going to be some collateral damage. And I think that's something that we should be fostering. That's something that we should be encouraging, because there's a lot of mediocrity, a lot of incompetence that's filling this space of power that needs to be moved. Full stop.
I love that framing, the mediocrity of the spaces of those in power at the moment. I completely agree. I think there's been a groundswell of young mob who are incredibly fierce, who have their own platforms. Everyone's using social media in different ways, who are stepping into rooms where they traditionally don't hold power and having their voices not only heard but acted upon as well. And I think that's really where we need to see the shift is don't just hear us, act upon the voices and what we're sharing. And in the same way that the last year and the Black Lives Matter movement or moment in Australia, because it lasted about a few months and everyone kind of moved on with their lives, which is incredibly devastating for community. Within that context, there is another groundswell of Australians wanting to listen and centre First Nations voices and amplify those voices. And I think with the fierceness that's coming with this new generation of young people who are speaking their truth, whatever their truth is, and not backing down in those spaces, we're going to see incredible shifts in terms of the way that Australia is centering their aspirations as young people. So I'm really excited about, the last year and what we're seeing in that space.
Yeah, so am I. I think it's a really exciting, time we're moving into. Can you guys add on to that at all?
Yeah, I think it's part of looking into your own identity, and I think people can relate that are descendants of the stolen generation as well, that you, in a way, as you grow older, may feel disconnected from culture, and finding ways in which to understand what those feelings are. And I actually had a talk with an old lady a couple of weeks ago, and she was telling me about her story and her skin name. And she told me, she asked what my story was, and I kind of give quite a generic thing because a lot of my story I don't know. And she said to me, it doesn't matter the stories you don't know because your ancestors are with you and they're in your heart and they follow you wherever you go. And I found that really powerful, and a way to really drive that work that you do to support those people that do have that culture. I mean, we all have that culture, but have those stories and the older people that, bring that out and give that to their children and their grandchildren. If there's ways that we can support them and kind of in a traditional sense, as a young person, it is our job to listen, and listening is a big part of that. And really taking in those stories and turning them into action as well.
I think on that point, I think that that's very true. I think the biggest thing for us as young mob coming through and our ferocity that Rona was talking about, I think that comes from our cultural strength. And, that exists in different forms to different people. And I always think of mine as my backbone, and that's the strength that has gotten me through, medical school, junior doctor training, things like that, and experiencing all these hard times is the cultural strength to sort of get through it and having that deep sense of purpose. And I think what other parts of the country are showing is this, like what Rona said, this fierce sort of new guard of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people coming through with cultural strength, that's sort of turning the system on its head. And it's funny because back in colonial days and settler days, they would never anticipate that. The whole aim was to assimilate and try to remove that cultural strength, but they underestimated how strong it actually is. And now we've got all of these people who, including all of us, I believe, who have this incredible ability to navigate a system that was designed against us, and with our cultural strength be able to succeed and achieve. And once you succeed and achieve, particularly in medicine, when you increase your sphere of influence, you're then able to inspire other people, lift other people up with you. And in my field, like, I usually find that with patients. So interacting with patients when they see an Aboriginal doctor, they then feel empowered as well. So I think that's important for like healing.
Just returning to sort of, I think all of you touched on a bit of a divide with, remote and urban, and all of us have worked in remote spaces, but exist in very urban spaces in a lot of our day-to-day lives. Kylie, in particular for you, you work with ranger groups a lot, so it's about land management and caring for country. And that's a lot of knowledge is held by the old people. How are the young people finding that, taking on that knowledge and, moving into those spaces that the old people have all the knowledge for?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because in my line of work, you do work a lot with the old people because they're the decision makers and they're the advisors and they have all of the knowledge, and you really want to tap into that. And I find it very interesting talking with old people because they have this perception of young people, and they say things like, this is very generic, saying things like, my grandkids are lazy, they don't go to work, they can't get out of bed. All they care about is grog and Facebook and, grandparents. They say a lot of things like that, and they really want these programs like ranger programs and community projects to really drive young people to, be in those leadership roles one day, and when they're gone, take their place. But they have these perceptions of young people, and it's interesting when you're talking, particularly with young rangers that are working, what they really want to get out of their work and their future, and they know what they want. They know their identity, they know their culture, and they know, where they want to be in 5, 10, 20 years. So I just find it quite interesting, the disconnect in some ways of the old people in their perceptions and the young people in their perceptions as well, but also, white fellas that go into community and work as like supervisors and expect young people to go to work from 8 o'clock till 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Monday to Friday, when you have workers that are living in a house with 20 other people, can't go to sleep because there's loud music all night, and have obligations at home and cultural obligations and looking after family. There's a lot of different perceptions, and I think that can be a barrier in some ways to young people. And I think finding ways to understand those different barriers, and not just painting it with a brush of they're lazy. Or, they don't come to work because they don't want to, which is, when you talk to those people, is not the case. There is a lot of things under the surface that are at play.
Do you think that's also because of many of them, coming into urban spaces and, they're probably very forward-facing, as are Indigenous cultures today? Is that coming into that as well, do you think?
Yeah, I think it can do, yeah. And it's a lot of, young people these days have different, a different, and old people say this too, they're growing up different than we did.
Of course.
And they're, young people these days have a different set of challenges, not saying that the old people didn't, of course they did, but a different set of challenges in how to navigate these two worlds and doing, they're responsible for their culture, but they're also responsible for a Western way of living as well. And it can be quite hard to navigate those two, I think.
Yeah, certainly. Can anyone else speak to that?
Yeah, I just think maybe like pretty hard to expect someone to fly if you've clipped their wings. And I think there's a lot of, people that are displaced as an Aboriginal person and then are stepping foot into other environments, whether that's a classroom, whether that's a sporting team, whether that's, a mainstream community and being displaced once again. So it's maybe a constant challenge, I think, in this fast-paced, ever-evolving, more complex world to, find your feet as a young First Nations person. And I think, from my perspective is how do we have empathy for that? How do we not see the person that isn't at work, as lazy or as someone that is, someone that is lazy or someone that doesn't have, the vigour that we expect, but how do we have empathy for that? How do we unpack that? How do we understand it? And then start to reframe it in a way that we can get people back up on their feet and moving again. So I also just think as well, I feel like I've opted out a little bit of this sort of like production line of living, go to school, go to university, get a job, get a house, have a family. It's broken. And it's no wonder, I think, why that there are a lot of, people, particularly those on the margins, that are kind of looking at it and going, well, that sucks. Why would I want to, input myself into that? So I think there's some real hurt that comes from people that, have not by choice been excluded from participation. But I think it's a chance for us to also reimagine and, look at that as perhaps an opportunity and recognise that, heck, what we've got is, is nowhere near the best that we can be. How do we start to recreate, these social systems and whatnot so that we can have, like the oldest group of humans on the planet, at the forefront and thriving. So, yeah. If anyone wants to join me in opting out, holler at the boy.
Do you have something to...
I agree with everything.
Stop going to the hospital.
We actually need you, though. Yeah. He's doing vascular stuff, which,
I agree with everything.
We kind of need that.
Yeah, we need you.
I think...
Minus you. Yeah.
No, I think what I see, picking up what Ben put down about empathy, I think that's important, and I've seen there's a shift in the way biomedical researchers approach projects and studies around black bodies. And so traditionally, people have always spoken about the deficits and that there's a gap and that there's disparities. And it's like, you're telling me as a young clinician, you're telling me things that I already know. Whereas what I'm learning now, particularly here in Darwin, I keep emphasising Darwin, I've been loving it up here.
Keep going to work.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, keep going to work. But what I find is, we're an oral history people. We learn from talking to each other and telling each other stories. And it's like I sit in a clinic and I hear mob tell me stories about, having fistulas or having diabetic foot problems and things like that. And then really delving into how they feel about it, how the family feels about it, how the community feels about it. It's interesting stuff. And so me and a few other people, we're looking at sort of putting a voice to that and showing people that, look, there's strength-based approaches to things. And, communities have been doing it for years, but just no one ever puts a label on it or no one wants to do it because it's not considered scientific enough in terms of Western research. And so there's a few of us now who are trying to put voices to mob who are experiencing things rather than just calculating some numbers and saying, look, there's a difference. Here you go.
There's a huge challenge in that, though, right? I mean, trying to change a whole Western, framework of medicine to a holistic.
And again, it's not going to happen overnight. It's just one little thing at a time. It's like a slow trickle feed. It's just something that's just going to drip away for a little while until people realise the value in it, because it's patient-centred, it's person-centred, and community-centred.
Is it shifting? I mean, I've done some work at Melbourne Uni that was looking at this exact stuff, and with the First Nations health team that's trying to really centre First Nations people, even in the education of Melbourne Uni medical students. And it is happening slowly, I think, and the students are super interested. But, you know, you can't have an Aboriginal doctor in every single ward in every single hospital. So.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is, like, we're at 3% of the population. We don't have the numbers to be able to treat all of our mob and have a patient, have a doctor for every single patient. But it doesn't mean that we can, like, it doesn't mean that we can't have, like, thousands of Aboriginal doctors. And yeah, I know the crew down in Melbourne. There's a couple of really fierce mob down there who, you know, are really leading the charge with making sure that, you know, medical students leave university feeling not guilty about the past, but empowered to try and make a difference and help, and being proper allies. I think that's the other important thing, is knowing how to be a good ally and a good support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Rona, I think you could speak to some allyship a little bit, or can you? Could you add to that and what it means to be a good ally? And I think, especially from my perspective, living in Melbourne and being back in Darwin, they're really different worlds for Aboriginal people, young people, I think. Can you speak to this, Rona?
Yeah, I think it's a term, you know, we're hearing more and more, and people are starting to unpack and understand it. But for me, allyship, you know, it's a verb, it's action, it's doing the work, but it never ends. And, you know, over the groundswell of the Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen more allies come into, you know, spaces where they're wanting to amplify First Nations voices and put their money where their mouth is and pay the rent and pay reparations, which I think is incredibly powerful. But I think there's constantly this missing piece around, you know, people will do the Instagram post, you know, donate a bit of money and then kind of dust their hands and then move on with their lives. But allyship is an act of, you know, constantly decolonising, constantly indigenising and looking at the ways we can continue to stand and support and back First Nations communities. I think that there's more education happening around allyship and what people can do, but I think as individuals and collectives, we've got to place the onus on people to continue to do the work. It's never done. In the same way that healing is never done, allyship must continue until the end of time, from my perspective.
Awesome. We've only got 10 minutes to go of the panel. I really wanted to allow the audience to join in our discussion and ask any questions you might have. I'm sure someone must. We've got some really interesting speakers and we've covered some really interesting topics. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I do. What is fun? Where is the fun in being an Aboriginal person?
Positivity.
Yeah.
It's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah, I think I'm happy to run at that. Just
please.
Yeah, maybe just before, you know, just in expression, in being. There, for me, is where I find a lot of the joy, and I think, you know, maybe over the last few years I've been so focused on an output and so focused on maybe what's in front of me, and have, then had an inability to be present and to smell the roses and to not just like hear the stories, but listen to them, not to just, you know, be in the company of the faces, but to kind of, you know, see the faces, you know, see the creases, see the eyes, see the, you know, the beauty that we as Aboriginal people have to offer. So I think for me, maybe the answer of where the fun is in the expression, it's in the doing, and I'm also maybe finding a lot of fun in the silence and in the being and in the solitude of, you know, not being at home, but being in, you know, a remarkable place in Darwin with, you know, living lands and waters that have, you know, plenty of stories to tell. So I think that's where I find a little bit of that fun and a little bit of that joy as well.
Yeah, I think the fun is definitely in sharing experiences and stories with, you know, other Aboriginal people. Like, I'm having incredible time here with this mob. Like, it's great. Like, haven't had a good yarn like this in a while. And, you know, spending time with family, sharing stories, sharing laughter, sharing the good times. And whether that's on country or not, I think it doesn't matter, because, you know, culture is where you take it. And I think that's the fun part as well, is knowing that you're tapped into something like that's millions of years old, and that gives you the strength. I think that's the fun. Like, and then being able to share that with other people is also fun as well.
I think being out on country, it's a big part of healing as well. And in my line of work, where I've been invited onto someone's country and told those stories of those places, and you really do feel it in your spirit, and that's what keeps you going. Until you see a snake, and then you run.
I think it's that, you know, it's that expression, as Benny was saying. I think there's such a privilege in that we get to be connected to 85,000 years of incredible knowledge.
100.
There's a lot of pressure that comes with that, you know? A lot of pressure to maintain, be strong in our culture, be strong in language, be strong in connection to country and relationality with country. But to be able to express that in a modern context is so exciting, and there's so much fun in that. And, you know, our communities and families are the funniest people alive.
Yeah.
And I think being connected in family spaces like that, where everyone could be a stand-up comedian, is a lot of fun, and something that I absolutely love about being Black.
We've actually got one in the audience, funny you mentioned. Sonda, if you want to stand up and give us a quick rendition. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
She can't hear you. Rona's just saying hello to you.
Oh, to me. Yeah, we love you, Sonda. There's Mum Ursula if you're looking for it too.
Any other questions? Hello.
I like what you said about being only as strong as your weakest link. What do you do to help heal people who are caught up in shame experiences? You were talking about expression as a form of healing and joy. What about people who are stifled by feeling shame?
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a great question. In my previous line of work, we mentored 6,000 Indigenous high school kids through school across the country. Shame was a feature, like a staple feature for a lot of those kids. So I think, for us, what was fused into our pedagogy, I guess, was that, as I was trying to say earlier on, is to reinforce that these kids aren't a problem and that they don't need to be fixed. And how can we find ways by learning their stories through patience, through empathy, through compassion, through unapologetic love, giving the things to these youngsters that they may have been starved from, to slowly allow them to unpack themselves and to feel comfortable in whatever space or environment that they're in. So it's for those kids as well, I think it's, and for any teachers in the room, I think it's important to keep turning up with that compassion, with that empathy, and to have an approach that is malleable, that is flexible, but is personalised for each individual. Because, as I said earlier on, it's we're not a homogenous group of people, right? No two of us, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, in the room are the same. So I think that's been the mindset when I'm around young people, and it's not an overnight thing, but something that if you can do consistently over an extended period of time, you may start to see results, or you may not see them. But in 3 or 4 years' time, when you bump into that youngster and they're stoked to let you know that the conversation that you had with them forced them to go and pursue university and become the first person in their family to finish school and go to university, that's when you might make a difference. That's when you might see the fruits from your labour. But I guess that's maybe my long-winded take on how we can tackle those situations.
I think with shame, it's such a deeply ingrained, insidious emotion that it takes a long time to recondition that and to remove that. And I think the mob at AIM, and I remember being an AIM mentor when I was at university, like the whole thing about telling young people that, you know, there's no such thing as shame. I think that's important, like reinforcing that. I think really spending time with individuals and talking about whether it's one-on-one or in sort of a supportive yarning circle, I think it's important to really nut out each part of what it is they think is shameful. And then I also think it's important to role model what being shame-free is like.
Yeah, it's really about spending that time to have that understanding. It doesn't always have to go straight to a solution.
Yeah.
You have to spend that time and shut up, be quiet, listen to them, what they have to say.
Absolutely.
Listening and, you know, silence can be a really powerful thing.
So this is a bit of an obscure one, but I wanted to put it forward regardless. Do you ever consider the idea that working in service delivery in the Northern Territory is a form of first contact, more so than anywhere else in Australia? If no, why do you not consider this so? What are the examples? And can it be helpful to frame in this way?
I love where you have to give an option and then you have to give an answer for each option. Like you just can't opt out. Yeah, you can't opt out. I'll take this one first. So, like I've been talking about it a lot and I feel like I've harped on it about a lot, but I've spent the last 2.5 years working in Sydney, and the patient demographic up here is just so different. And it just comes down to population numbers. So here, like there's less people living in the entire territory than in Wollongong on the south coast of New South Wales. And so when you come to a place like Darwin or anywhere in the territory, because there's not that population density, the issues are highlighted easier. You see them easier. Whereas in Sydney, there's 4 million people. So the homelessness, the social injustices, all of that sort of stuff gets diluted down because there's so many people. Whereas up here, you see it all the time. I personally think that there is a huge element of colonisation and first contact still happening here in the Northern Territory. I come from a place that was very close to the epicentre of colonisation, and so our mob went through a lot of the trauma 200 years ago, whereas I feel, and I'm very mindful that there's mob in the room here who are from here, and I'm very mindful I don't want to cause offence, but there's mob here who are going through the same issues that people in the East Coast went through hundreds of years ago. And so there's definitely an element of active colonisation happening here, I feel. I think that being here, supporting your local Indigenous owned organisations, supporting local communities, whether it be via their artwork or like tourism and visiting communities and taking these ranger tours and going and exploring country, I think all of those things are important parts of like coexisting in a place like Darwin.
Yeah, I don't know, Rona, if you've got anything to add to that, but it's maybe just back to that first question, because it is well done. I see, and I totally hear what you're saying, that maybe the acts of injustice, the desecration of sites, the Northern Territory intervention, which is designed to displace, and assimilate and take complete control, over, people's homelands, people's places, is certainly acts of colonisation in the 21st century, I guess. But I think for me, if people are feeling that, working in service delivery and they're feeling that, then it's probably because that, First Nations people haven't been centred in that service delivery, and that maybe whatever it is that you're delivering is coming through a colonial frame. From my perspective, I haven't done heaps of work up in the Northern Territory, particularly at a grassroots level a little bit, but not enough to have a really valuable input. But I've never necessarily felt personally that I'm contributing to that sort of colonial project or mentality. I've always found familiarity with the people that I've come across, the communities that I've worked with, the places that I've been. But I think it is, if you ever are feeling like that for non-Aboriginal people in the room, maybe it's a chance for pausity and reflection, and, to take a step back and, ask some really compromising and uncomfortable questions, because for as long as we're proceeding forward with these service deliveries which are assimilative in nature, which are slowly stripping away the things that sustain a group of people, then you're a part of the problem. I don't know if that answers directly the question, which is a very good question, but that's maybe my take on it, yeah.
Nice, good answer.
Thank you.
We've actually reached the end of the discussion today. It's already past 1 o'clock.
Wow.
So I'm going to draw it to a close. Thank you guys so much for coming and listening to our incredible panellists. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Kylie. Thank you, Justin. Rona on the big screen, thank you so much. Massive love to you, zooming in from Melbourne. So lucky to have you. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of Garrmalang Festival.